My son sold my farm? He froze when I showed him the deed of gift. I stood in the pouring rain on the spacious porch of my son's luxurious mansion, and the cold water streamed relentlessly down my worn-out old overalls, hopelessly mixing with something salty and bitter on my wrinkled cheeks. I don't know if anyone would have noticed the difference between the raindrops and the tears of disappointment and pain. The massive front door, made of expensive mahogany, the very one Marcus had paid more money for than I had managed to earn in the last 5 difficult years, was tightly closed in front of me, but not so tightly that I couldn't hear his voice drifting from the depths of the house. My boy, my only and dearly beloved son, for whom I had given my whole life. "As soon as the old man finally signs these damn papers," he said casually, with such cold nonchalance in his confident tone, as if he were discussing routine garbage collection or buying a new car, "we'll immediately send him to some state-run old age home. Let him eat his watery oatmeal there with the other pathetic losers and whiners like himself." A woman's laugh rang out, high-pitched, shrill, and piercing, like the sound of crystal glass shattering on a marble floor. Tiffany, his young, magazine-cover model wife, who winced and recoiled disdainfully every time I fatherly attempted to give her a warm hug or even shake her hand. I froze in place, as if struck by lightning. My calloused hand, covered with age spots and thick corns from 40 long years of heavy manual labor at the noisy Ford factory in industrial Detroit, stopped mere inches from the polished doorbell. "Mr. Harris," this was a third voice, incredibly smooth and oily, like fresh butter, clearly belonging to a lawyer or real estate agent. "I perfectly understand your impatience in this matter, but according to current law, the property transfer documents must be personally signed by the legal owner himself. That land in rural Georgia," he whistled meaningfully, "major developers are offering a whole $2.8 million for it. For you, that will be a clean $2.5 million after deducting my standard commission for services. $2.5 million. For the sacred land of my great-grandfather Isaiah. For those very 120 acres of red clay soil and ancient pine groves, where he was buried in an unmarked grave without a headstone, because in distant 1923, black people were not allowed a decent place in a white cemetery with a fence." I slowly, as if in slow motion, lowered my trembling hand. The autumn rain intensified significantly, turning into a real downpour. Heavy drops drummed on the rusty roof of my old 1990 Chevrolet pickup, the only property I had left after the difficult and painful divorce from Martha. No, not entirely the only one, to be honest. I still had that land, and I had a son whom I had raised. Now I wasn't so sure about the second point. "Dad will definitely come for Thanksgiving," Marcus continued in a confident tone, and I vividly imagined him casually waving his impeccably manicured hand, on which an expensive Rolex gleamed brightly. I had given him that prestigious Swiss watch for his 40th birthday. I had to sell my beloved old Harley-Davidson to raise the necessary amount and buy it. "We'll have a traditional family dinner with turkey. He'll calmly sign all the papers. We'll culturally drink to success, and the deal will be done. The old man doesn't even approximately understand how much that abandoned land is really worth at modern prices. He naively thinks he is doing me a big favor by transferring it." Something unbearably cold and heavy, like a piece of ice, slowly sank right into my chest, squeezing my heart. It wasn't anger, not yet, not now, just absolute emptiness. The feeling was as if some cruel person had taken a blunt, rusty knife and carved out a massive chunk of my wounded heart, and hadn't even bothered to crudely stitch up the bleeding wound. I silently turned on my heels and walked slowly toward my car. My old work boots sloshed loudly through the numerous puddles on the asphalt. Behind my back, I suddenly heard the heavy door slightly creak open. "Dad?"
Marcus's voice sounded genuinely surprised and even slightly alarmed. "Is that you standing there? Why didn't you call me in advance that you were coming?"
I slowly turned over my shoulder. He stood in the illuminated doorway in a pristine white Ralph Lauren shirt, casually holding a crystal glass of expensive Scotch whiskey in his well-groomed hand. My son, 42 years old, fit and athletic build, a flawless, fashionable $150 haircut from an elite barber shop. I suddenly vividly remembered cutting his hair myself when he was a child, in our cramped kitchen, carefully covering his skinny shoulders with an old faded towel. "Just passing by on business," I said as quietly and evenly as possible. "Wanted to stop by for a bit, to see you. But now I see you are very busy with important matters." Something fleeting flashed in his brown eyes. Guilt? Shame? Or just ordinary annoyance from an unexpected visit? "Listen, Dad, I have an important business meeting with partners right now. Maybe you can drop by another time when I'm free. We'll definitely see each other anyway on Family Thanksgiving, right?" I nodded silently, slowly, and resignedly. That's how tired old men nod when they no longer understand anything at all in this rapidly changing world. "Of course, son. See you on Thanksgiving." I got into my pickup truck with a heavy effort, slamming the door shut. The old engine struggled to start, only on the third persistent attempt, as was usually the case. In the fogged-up rear-view mirror, I clearly saw Marcus standing motionless under the porch canopy, nervously covering his cell phone with his free hand. Then the massive door slammed shut abruptly, and the bright light in the large panoramic windows became even brighter, even more inaccessible and colder for me. I slowly drove out onto the wet night highway. The squeaky wipers monotonously scraped across the dirty windshield. The old radio quietly played a soulful blues. B.B. King, his famous "The Thrill Is Gone." How symbolic and spot-on that was. They arrogantly thought I was just another old fool from rural Georgia. 74 years of life lived, only an 8th grade education, calloused hands that treacherously tremble when I pour myself my morning coffee. An ordinary man who stubbornly wears the same worn Carhartt overalls for a good 10 years in a row and is forced to carefully count every earned dollar until his meager pension. They completely failed to grasp one important thing about my past. More precisely, they didn't know 3 critically important things at once. But more on that, a little later, in its own time. Now, as I silently drove back to my modest rented room above a noisy Chinese restaurant in a small Decatur, I continuously thought about the papers, about those very crucial documents that lay securely in my battered old army backpack. Documents that I had carried with me constantly for the last 20 long years, ever since the sad time my beloved Lorraine unexpectedly died of cancer. Marcus so badly wanted to get my signature on Thanksgiving. He will certainly get it, you can be sure. Only not on the papers and documents he so confidently expects to see. But what happened next on that same rainy evening when I finally returned to my room and anxiously opened that cherished backpack? That frightened and shocked me even more than the cruel words of my own only son. I was sitting in my small room above the Chinese restaurant, holding the yellowed envelope with the documents, and listening to the November rain drumming against the tin ledge of the fire escape outside the window, a monotonous, insistent, endless sound under which I had lived the last 8 years of my life. This sound had become a kind of time metronome for me, counting the days of my loneliness in this cramped space that barely fit a bed, a table, a chair, and an old chest of drawers. The raindrops fell with a certain rhythm, tick, 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 boom, tick, 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 boom, like Morse code transmitting some secret message that I had never learned to decipher all these years.
The familiar smells wafted from downstairs, fried ginger, garlic, soy sauce, hot chili pepper, and muffled voices in the Cantonese dialect, which I had never learned all this time. Even though Mr. Chen, the restaurant owner, had tried several times to teach me at least how to say hello properly. These smells had soaked into the walls of my room so deeply that even my clothes were saturated with them. Sometimes, when I went outside on rare sunny days, people would wrinkle their noses as they walked past me, and I knew that I smelled of the Chinese restaurant kitchen, of a foreign culture, a foreign life that I had never truly managed to enter, remaining an eternal observer outside the window.
Mr. Chen was a kind man. Short, lean, with eyes perpetually moist from steam and hands covered in small scars from knives and hot oil. He lowered my rent after learning that I lived only on Social Security, and he never reminded me about money if I was a week or two late with the payment. His wife, Mrs. Chen, a round-faced woman with gray streaks in her black hair, sometimes brought me leftovers from the restaurant. Fried rice with vegetables, sweet and sour chicken, sometimes even dumplings that she made with her own hands every morning at 4 o'clock. I thanked her in broken English, which she understood as poorly as I understood her Cantonese, and we exchanged those awkward smiles of people separated by a language barrier, but united by a shared loneliness in this big, indifferent city. The phone lay on the worn table beside me, an old Nokia that Marcus once called a museum exhibit, with that condescending smirk that wealthy people reserve for poor relatives. I remembered the day he came to visit me, the only time in the last 5 years, and his gaze skimmed over my room with such poorly concealed disgust that I wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor. He stood in the middle of the room in his expensive suit, which probably cost more than all my furniture combined, and I saw how he tried not to touch anything, how he breathed shallowly, trying not to inhale the smells of the Chinese cuisine, how his fingers nervously drummed on his thigh, a gesture he inherited from me, although he probably didn't know or would want to know. I looked at the phone and thought about the call from Eleanor Jackson that changed everything. Not the land transfer documents themselves. They had been lying in that envelope for 20 years, like Lorraine's will, like the last wish of a woman who understood people better than I could ever hope to understand. Lorraine always saw the essence of things. She saw what was hidden behind words and actions. She knew Marcus better than I did, even though I was his father. She foresaw this day when my son would come for the land, like a vulture circling a dying animal. She told me about it in the last days of her life, when cancer was eating her from the inside, when morphine clouded her mind, but her eyes remained clear and perceptive. James, she told me then, lying in the hospital bed, so fragile and small that it seemed as if she had already halfway crossed into another world. James, you must promise me. Promise me you won't give the land to Marcus. Not now, maybe never. He doesn't understand. He grew up here in the north. He never felt the red clay of Georgia beneath his feet, never heard the wind rustling in the pines on the hill where your great-grandfather is buried. For him, it's just money, just numbers on paper. No, it was that call 3 days ago when Eleanor's voice trembled with excitement so much that I first thought something bad had happened. Eleanor Jackson was the director of the African American Heritage Preservation Foundation, the non-profit organization to which Lorraine had bequeathed the management of our land. I had met Eleanor only once, 20 years ago, when I signed the documents transferring the land into the foundation's trust. Back then, she was a young woman, full of enthusiasm and faith in the importance of her work. Now, her voice sounded weary from many years of struggle to preserve the memory of those whom history tried to forget. "Mr. Carter," she said then, and I remember squeezing the receiver with my calloused hand, covered with age spots and thick corns that hadn't disappeared even after 8 years since I last held a wrench at the Ford factory. "Mr. Carter, I have to tell you something. It concerns your land in Georgia.
We were conducting research there, as planned by the terms of the deed of gift, and, God, I don't even know where to begin."
I heard her take a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts. Outside my room at that moment, the sun was shining, a rare October sun that broke through the smog and city dust, bathing the room in golden light. I remember that contrast, the sunshine outside and the cold fear inside me, because I already knew that good news never begins with the words, "I don't even know where to begin." I sat down then on the only chair in my room, the very one I am sitting on now, and prepared to hear that the foundation could no longer maintain the land, that they needed to sell it, that 20 years ago I had made a mistake trusting the words of my dying wife. I had found this chair on the street many years ago. Someone had thrown it out, deeming it unfit for use. I fixed it, reinforced the legs, and upholstered the seat with an old blanket. It creaked under my weight, although I had lost so much weight over the years that my old jeans hung loose on my hips, and I had to tighten my belt to the last hole, which I had made myself with a rusty nail. But Eleanor said something completely different. "We found them, Mr. Carter. We found the graves." Graves, plural, not just the one unmarked grave of my great-grandfather Isaiah that I had known about since childhood, which my father had shown me when I was 8 years old, saying, "Your great-great-grandfather lies here, boy. Here lies the man who bought this land with his own hands, his sweat, his blood in 1923, when a black man in the South was only sold land if he was either very lucky or very stubborn. And Isaiah was both." I remembered that day as clearly as if it were yesterday, though more than 60 years had passed. A hot August afternoon, cicadas sang in the grass so loudly that it seemed as if the air was vibrating from their song. My father held my hand, his palm was enormous, calloused, warm, and led me across the field to a small hill where 3 old pines grew. Beneath one of them, in the shade, lay a simple gray stone with a faded inscription, "Isaiah Carter, 1889 to 1954, free man on free land." I remembered that day as clearly as if it were yesterday, though more than 60 years had passed. A hot August afternoon, cicadas sang in the grass so loudly that it seemed as if the air was vibrating from their song. My father held my hand, his palm was enormous, calloused, warm, and led me across the field to a small hill where 3 old pines grew. Beneath one of them, in the shade, lay a simple gray stone with a faded inscription, "Isaiah Carter, 1889 to 1954, free man on free land."
"How many?" I asked Eleanor then, and my voice sounded hoarse, as if I hadn't spoken for days. In fact, I really had barely spoken. Who was I to talk to in this room? Mr. Chen knew only a few English phrases related to the restaurant and the rent. The other tenants in the house, a Mexican family downstairs, a Vietnamese student across the hall, kept to themselves, each immersed in their own struggle for survival in this city that did not forgive weakness and poverty. 17, Mr. Carter, 17 burials, dated from the period between 1867 and 1882. We brought in archaeologists from Emory University, specialists in African American history of the Reconstruction era. Mr. Carter, your land is not just a plot. It's a cemetery for freed slaves. It's a historical monument. 17. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine 17 graves, 17 lives, 17 stories buried under the red clay of Georgia. 17 people who had walked through the hell of slavery and emerged on the other side, into a freedom that was so fragile, so uncertain in those years after the Civil War, when the South lay in ruins and the future was murky and frightening. I remember the receiver trembling in my hand, how something hot and salty rose to my throat, how thunder cracked outside the window, even though it was a clear October day. Or did I imagine it? Memory plays cruel tricks on me lately. Sometimes I wake up and don't immediately realize where I am. In the room above the Chinese restaurant, or in the old house in Detroit where Lorraine and I lived, where Marcus grew up, where I was happy without realizing it, taking happiness for granted, like the air you breathe without considering its value. There are names, Eleanor continued, and her voice held something akin to reverence. Not on all the graves, but on some, roughly carved into stones, on wooden planks that miraculously survived. Samuel Freeman, 1870. Rebecca Washington, died in 1873, 32 years old. Ezekiel, Mr. Carter, there's a grave with the name Ezekiel Carter, died in 1882.
Ezekiel, my great-great-great-grandfather, whom my father spoke of as a legend, as a man who walked on foot from Savannah to that patch of red clay land in Georgia, leading 17 people with him, former slaves from the plantation where he worked as a blacksmith. A man whom I thought of as a family myth, like a fairy tale that old people tell children so they can be proud of their roots. My father said that Ezekiel was a huge man, 6 feet and 4 inches tall, with hands that could bend a horseshoe with his bare fingers, with a voice that boomed like thunder when he sang hymns on Sunday morning. "This changes everything, Mr. Carter," Eleanor said, and I heard her flipping through some papers on the other end of the line. "We've filed an application to have your land included in the National Register of Historic Places. That means full federal protection. It means no one will ever be able to build a shopping center or a housing complex there. It means—" She continued talking, explaining legal technicalities, procedures, timelines, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was thinking about Marcus, about my son, who wanted to sell this land for $2,800,000 to some developer who planned to build an elite residential complex there, with panoramic windows and marble floors. Marcus had shown me the prospectus for this complex a month ago when he came with another proposal to resolve the land issue once and for all. Glossy pages with computer graphics depicting luxurious mansions, swimming pools, tennis courts. Magnolia Estate, that's what they were going to call the place. The irony was so obvious that I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I thought about how bulldozers would have rolled over the 17 graves of people whose names had been erased from history, but who now, 140 years later, had a chance to be heard again. I imagined those machines, yellow, enormous, merciless, as they tore up the earth, flipped over layers of red clay, crushed the stones upon which loving hands had once carved the names of the deceased. Samuel Freeman, Rebecca Washington, Ezekiel Carter. Names that would turn to dust beneath the treads of progress and someone's greed. I thought about how my son, my only and dearly beloved son, for whom I worked 40 years in the factory, for whom I gave up vacations and weekends, for whom I wore the same worn Carhartt overalls for 10 years straight to save money for his education. This son hadn't even asked me about the land. He hadn't wondered why it was so important to me. He hadn't wanted to know the story of the 17 graves and the man named Ezekiel who led his people to freedom. When Marcus was little, I used to tell him stories about our family, about Georgia, about the land that waited for us there, like a promise of a better future. He listened then, his eyes wide open, asking questions, begging for more and more. But then he grew up. He went to college. He got an MBA. He married Catherine, a blonde woman from a wealthy family, who looked at me as if I were something unpleasant stuck to the sole of her designer shoe. And gradually, year after year, the stories stopped interesting him. The past became a burden to him, something inconvenient that was best not mentioned in the company of his new friends and business partners. Now, sitting in my room and listening to the rain, I opened the envelope and took out another document, the one Eleanor had sent me yesterday via express mail. An official letter from the U.S. National Park Service, printed on thick cream paper with gold embossing.
I read it slowly, tracing my finger over the lines, just as I learned to read in 8th grade, the last grade I completed before going to work. Education had always been difficult for me. Not because I was stupid, no, just because in our family, work was more important than school. I had to help my father. I had to earn money. I had to survive. The parcel of 120 acres, known as the Carter Land, located in Taliaferro County, Georgia, is officially recognized as an object of national historical significance. The burial site of African American settlers from the Reconstruction era. Inviolable status. Any attempts to sell, develop, or alter the landscape constitute a federal crime.
A federal crime. I reread those words several times, feeling something heavy and cold settle in my chest. A federal crime. This meant Marcus could not sell the land. Never, under no circumstances. This meant the 17 graves were safe, that the memory of Ezekiel and his people would be preserved, that their sacrifice was not in vain. I folded the letter back into the envelope and looked at the calendar hanging on the wall next to a faded photograph of Lorraine. The calendar was free, promotional, from a Chinese bank. Mr. Chen brought me one every year. In the photo, Lorraine was smiling at me, young and beautiful, just as I remembered her on our wedding day. Her dress was simple, white, bought at a thrift store, but to me she was more beautiful than all the brides in the world. There were 4 days left until Thanksgiving. 4 days until the moment Marcus planned to seat me at his luxurious table, pour me expensive wine, smile his flawless smile, and lay the land transfer documents before me. 4 days until the moment he thought I would sign them with my trembling old man's hand, because I am an old fool from the country who doesn't understand what's what. But there was one more thing Marcus didn't know. One more small detail that I never told him because some stories are too painful to share, even with your own son. Some memories are better kept locked deep inside, where they can't hurt anyone but yourself. I stood up, walked to the old chest of drawers, the only piece of furniture I took from the house after Lorraine's death, and opened the bottom drawer. The chest was heavy, massive, made of dark wood that had grown even darker over the years. Lorraine bought it at a clearance sale many years ago, when we first moved to Detroit, when we had almost nothing but hope and love for each other. There, beneath a stack of faded t-shirts and worn jeans, lay a battered leather folder. I hadn't opened it for many years. I didn't want to. But now, as the rain intensified and turned into a real downpour, and thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance, I knew the time had come. Inside the folder lay photographs, black and white, faded, with curled corners. In one of them, a young man in a military uniform stood at attention in front of the American flag. I was 22 years old in that photograph, 1970, Vietnam. I looked at my young face, so serious, so full of determination to serve my country, to defend the freedom I still believed in back then. The eyes in the photo were clear, unclouded by what I was about to see in the jungles of Southeast Asia. And there was also a medal, the Bronze Star, for valor. I received it after an operation in the Mekong Delta, when I pulled 3 wounded comrades from under fire, when bullets whizzed overhead like angry wasps, when the ground exploded all around from mortar shells. I never told Marcus about this medal. I never told him about Vietnam at all. What could I tell him? That his father killed people in a foreign country for goals that even the generals couldn't clearly explain? That I watched my friends die in the mud and blood, crying out the names of their mothers and loved ones? That I returned home a different man, broken inside, even though all the external wounds had healed? The rain outside intensified, turning into a real storm. The wind rocked the fire escape, making the metal creak and groan.
Somewhere below, on the street, someone was shouting in Spanish. Cars were honking, sirens wailed. The usual cacophony of city life that I had never gotten used to all these years. I put the medal back into the folder and closed the drawer of the chest. 4 days. 4 days until the meeting with my son, who thought he knew me, but knew nothing. 4 days until the moment I would tell him the truth, that the land was no longer his, that it belonged to history, that 17 graves were more important than his plans to become even richer. I didn't know how he would react. Would he yell? Would he accuse me of betrayal? Or would he simply turn and walk away, erasing me from his life completely, as one erases a failed line from an accounting ledger? But I knew one thing. Lorraine would have been proud of me. And Ezekiel, and Samuel Freeman, and Rebecca Washington, and all the others whose names were carved on the stones beneath the pines in Georgia. I had finally done what I had to do. I protected their memory. I preserved their land.
The rain continued to drum on the tin ledge, but now the sound didn't seem so lonely to me. Somewhere in that rhythm I heard the voices of the past, the voices of those who had walked their path to the end and could now rest in peace. I sat in my small room above the Golden Dragon restaurant, and the smell of fried ginger and garlic rose through the cracks in the floor, so familiar that I had long stopped noticing it, although now for some reason it seemed especially sharp, almost suffocating. The leather folder lay before me on the worn table, which I had bought 15 years ago at a bankrupt's property sale for $20, and the light from the single bulb hanging from the ceiling on a cracked cord fell upon the faded brown leather, scarred by the scratches of time. The bronze star medal lay on top of the documents, heavy, cold, with tarnished bronze that once gleamed in the Washington sun when it was presented to me in 1972. I ran my calloused fingers over the star, and memory burst forth like a breached dam. Vietnam, the Mekong Delta, 1971, July, when the heat was so intense that the air melted before my eyes, and every breath burned my lungs. I was a corporal, 27 years old, and I pulled 5 wounded men from a burning helicopter. 3 white guys from Ohio, 1 Puerto Rican from the Bronx, and a young lieutenant who was screaming that he didn't want to die, that he had a pregnant wife at home with a second child. Fire licked the metal, ammunition exploded like popcorn in a skillet, and I made trip after trip, even though shrapnel was lodged in my thigh and blood ran into my boot, filling it with a warm, sticky liquid. The lieutenant's name was James Connolly, a white guy from Boston, with family connections, a Harvard education, and a future in politics. He survived. All 5 survived. And I got a medal and a 7-inch scar on my left thigh that still aches before the rain, like an old barometer. Marcus never asked about the war, not once. Not even when he was little and found my old photos in uniform in a drawer. Not even when the school had Veterans Day and other children brought stories of their grandfathers and fathers. He simply wasn't interested. To him, I was just a factory worker, a man with dirty hands and an 8th grade education, someone to be ashamed of at parent-teacher meetings.
I put the medal aside and took out the first document from the folder, a letter on United States Congressional letterhead dated 2003, elegant typeface, official seal. "Dear Mr. Carter," it began, and I remembered how my hands trembled when I first opened that envelope 20 years ago in the hospital room where Lorraine was dying. Congressman James Connolly, the very lieutenant I pulled from the fire, wrote that he had learned about my situation through a mutual acquaintance, that he had never forgotten that day in the Mekong Delta, that he wanted to help, that he had connections in the Department of the Interior, the National Archives, the Smithsonian Institution. "Your land in Georgia represents invaluable historical importance," he wrote in his steady hand, which was probably dictated to an assistant. "I can ensure that it receives federal protection.
that the memory of your great-grandfather and all those buried there will be preserved forever. It is a small price for what you did for me and my men." The second document was correspondence with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, an archaeological report compiled by Dr. Martin Wilshire from Emory University, dated 2023, just 1 year ago. 17 burials, artifacts from the Reconstruction period, fragments of a Bible in the Gullah language, iron tools, remnants of the county's first free church, and the grave of Ezekiel Carter, my great-great-great-grandfather, with an engraved stone on which the words were barely legible. "He led his people home." 1824-1891.
I didn't know about this when I signed the deed of gift 20 years ago. Back then it was just land, red clay and pines, a place where I had never lived, but which held the bones of my ancestors. Lorraine insisted. "Joe," she whispered, her voice weak, almost inaudible because of the morphine and the cancer devouring her from within. "Don't let Marcus sell it, please. I know our son. I know what he has become. He will sell it, and they'll build a shopping center or a parking lot there, and everything will disappear. Everything that came before us." She saw right through him even then, 20 years ago, when he was only 22 and just starting his business. She saw the coldness in his eyes when he counted the money she and I had saved for his education. She saw how he winced when I came to his graduation in my only suit, cheap, bought at Walmart, with a tie that didn't quite match the color. The third document was the Certificate of Land Registration as a National Historical Landmark, signed by the Secretary of the Interior in 2024, only 3 months ago. Federal protection, inalienability, eternal preservation. Marcus knew nothing. He thought the land was still mine, that he could trick the old father, slip him the papers, get a signature from the old man's trembling hand, who was too foolish or too old to understand what he was signing. $2,800,000, a commission of $300,000 for the realtor. Pure profit for my only son, my boy, whom I raised by working 2 shifts so he could go to a good school, wear new clothes, and never know what hunger or cold was. I folded the documents back into the folder, slowly, neatly, as one folds something very fragile and precious. My hands were not shaking. Strangely, at this moment, I felt absolute calm, a calm I hadn't experienced since that day in Vietnam when I made the last run toward the burning helicopter and knew I might not return, but also knew I had to try.
In the corner of the room, on the only shelf, was a photograph in a simple wooden frame. Lorraine and I on our wedding day, 1978. She was in a simple white dress we bought at a second-hand store for $30. I was in a rented suit. We were smiling, genuine, broad smiles, because we were happy, because we loved each other, because we believed everything would be all right. "I did what you asked, dear," I whispered into the empty room, and for a moment the scent of her perfume, cheap but so familiar, seemed to overpower the aroma of fried ginger. The land is protected. The memory is protected. Now all that's left is to show our son who he really is. The phone rang. The old push-button phone I bought at a dollar store because I saw no point in $800 smartphones. The number was unfamiliar, but I recognized the area code, the same as Marcus's. "Dad?" My son's voice sounded unusually soft, almost affectionate, and I immediately knew the game had begun. "I was just thinking, we haven't properly seen each other in so long. Maybe you could come to us for Thanksgiving. Tiffany will be cooking turkey. We'll invite a couple of friends. Like old times, remember?" In old times, we ate Thanksgiving dinner as a trio, me, him, and Lorraine, in our small apartment. And the turkey was the size of a large chicken because we couldn't afford a bigger one. Marcus was 8 years old then, and he was happy, or I thought he was happy. "Of course, son," I replied, my voice sounding tired, old, exactly the way he wanted to hear it. I'd be glad to, very glad. You know, I was thinking about that land in Georgia. Maybe we really should do something with it. I'm getting old, I don't need it, and maybe it will come in handy for you." The pause on the other end of the line was too long, too significant. "Yes, Dad," Marcus finally said, and I could hear him smiling, a predatory, self-satisfied smile. "Let's discuss it over dinner. I can help you with all the formalities. You know, these legal things are complicated, and I have a good lawyer." "Thank you, son," I said, putting all the gratitude I was capable of into my voice. "You've always been so thoughtful."
When I hung up, my hand rested on the leather folder. Thanksgiving, how symbolic. A day when we give thanks for what we have, for family, for blessings. On that day, my son would learn whom he lost when he decided that money was more important than blood. But he wouldn't learn everything yet, because there was one more thing in that folder, a fourth document that even Eleanor Jackson from the Foundation didn't know about. I sat in my old Chevrolet pickup for a good 20 minutes after I slammed the door shut. The heavy metallic sound echoed in the night silence, like the final chord of a funeral march. The rain hammered on the cabin roof with the monotonous constancy of a metronome, and each drop felt like a small hammer blow on a nail, sealing the coffin of my last illusions about the person I had once held in my arms, taught to walk, taught to distinguish truth from lies. My hands, these calloused hands, covered with age spots and rough corns, hands that had assembled cars on the Ford conveyor belt for 40 years, that had worked the red clay soil of Georgia, that had held the dying Lorraine in her final hours, were trembling so violently that I couldn't even insert the key into the ignition. Not from cold. The cold outside was nothing compared to the lump of ice that had solidified somewhere around my solar plexus, extending its frosty tentacles toward my heart, my lungs, my throat. I looked at the illuminated windows of Marcus's mansion, those huge panoramic windows behind which crystal chandeliers, probably worth more than I had earned in the last 5 years, were visible. The silhouette of my son flashed in one of the second-floor windows. He was saying something, gesturing, probably telling Tiffany how cleverly he had managed the old fool from the country, how brilliantly he had played the show of care and filial love. I wondered if they were laughing. Were they clinking glasses of expensive champagne, celebrating the impending $2,800,000? Were they already discussing what they would spend that money on? Maybe a new latest model Mercedes for Tiffany? Or a trip to the Maldives, to one of those resorts where a room costs $10,000 a night?
I closed my eyes, and in the darkness behind my eyelids, a picture emerged, bright, clear, painfully real. Marcus was 6 years old. Lorraine and I had just moved to Detroit from Georgia. I got a job at the factory. We were renting a tiny 2-room apartment on the outskirts where gunshots and police sirens could be heard at night. Money was desperately short. I was earning minimum wage, and Lorraine worked as a cleaner at a hospital. But Marcus wanted a bicycle. Not just a bicycle, a specific model of a bright red Schwinn Stingray with chrome handlebars and a banana seat, which he saw in the storefront window on Woodward Avenue. I remember him pressing his nose against the glass, his eyes, so big, so full of childlike delight and dreams, reflecting the sheen of the chrome parts. "Dad," he said then in his thin little voice, "when I grow up, I'll work hard like you, and I'll buy you something beautiful, I promise." I worked 2 jobs for 4 months. The Ford factory from 6 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, then as a loader in a warehouse from 4 until midnight. I slept 3 or 4 hours a night. Lorraine cried, begged me to stop, said I would kill myself, that a bicycle wasn't worth my health. But I saw the eyes of my boy, and I couldn't, simply physically couldn't disappoint him.
On Christmas 1989, I will never forget that date. It is seared into my memory with a hot iron. I brought that very Schwinn Stingray into our tiny apartment, tied with a huge red bow. Marcus screamed with delight so loudly that the downstairs neighbors started pounding on the ceiling. He hugged me, his small arms wrapped around my neck, and he whispered in my ear, "You are the best dad in the world. I love you more than anything." Where is that boy? Where did he go? When exactly did the metamorphosis happen that turned that bright-eyed child who promised to buy me something beautiful into a cynical predator planning to fleece his own father and lock him away in an old people's home like a faulty mechanism that no longer serves a purpose? I opened my eyes and looked at the brown folder lying on the passenger seat. Even in the dim light of the street lamp, breaking through the streams of rain on the windshield, I could make out the worn edges, the faded cardboard, the coffee stain in the bottom right corner. A memory of that morning 3 years ago when I was sitting in Eleanor Jackson's office and my hands were shaking so much from anxiety that I spilled coffee right onto the documents. 3 documents, 3 pieces of paper that turned Marcus's entire cunning plan into smoke, into dust, into nothing. But there was a 4th document, the one that even Eleanor didn't know about, the one I received only 2 weeks ago, and which I had hidden in the very depths of the folder, between the pages of the deed of gift to the foundation. I took out the folder, opened it with trembling fingers, carefully pushed aside the first 3 documents, and extracted an envelope made of thick cream paper with embossing in the upper left corner. Office of Congressman James T. Connolly, 3rd District of Georgia. The letter arrived on October 23rd. I remember the exact date because it was Lorraine's birthday. She would have been 71 if cancer hadn't taken her 20 years ago. I was just about to drive to the cemetery, carrying a bouquet of white lilies, her favorite flowers, when the mail carrier handed me this envelope. Inside was a letter on official U.S. congressional letterhead, printed on the same thick cream paper. I reread it about 15 times then, unable to believe my eyes. Then I called the number provided, spoke with the congressman's assistant, a young man with a polite voice and a northern accent, who confirmed every word. The land in Georgia, those very 120 acres of red clay and ancient pines where my great-great-great-grandfather Ezekiel and 16 other freed slaves rested, received more than just historical landmark status. Congressman Connolly, the very man I had once pulled from a burning helicopter in the jungles of Vietnam in 1968, Lieutenant Connolly back then, a young intelligence officer with a bullet wound in his leg, had pushed a special bill through the committee. The land was included in the National Register of Historic Places of African American Heritage.
But that wasn't all. The congressman secured a federal grant of $875,000 for the creation of a memorial complex and educational center. The African American Heritage Preservation Foundation, to whom I had entrusted the land 20 years ago, was receiving this money to build a museum, restore the graves, and create an archive. And here it is, the detail that made me sit down right on the steps of the porch of my rented room above the Chinese restaurant that October 23rd, unable to stand. I was appointed lifelong honorary curator of the site, with an annual stipend of $32,000 for the rest of my days. $32,000 a year for a man who had lived on $900 a month in Social Security for the last 10 years. This was a fortune. This was freedom. This was the opportunity not to count every cent at the grocery store, not to decide whether to buy blood pressure medication or pay for electricity. But I didn't tell anyone, not even Eleanor Jackson. The first payment was due to arrive on December 1st, 8 days after Thanksgiving. I folded the letter back up, tucked the envelope between the pages of the documents, and closed the folder. The rain intensified, turning into a real downpour, hammering on the pickup roof with the fury of an enraged drummer.
Lightning struck somewhere in the distance, momentarily lighting up the sky with a ghostly violet light. Marcus thought I was a poor old man, pathetic and helpless. He thought he could manipulate me like a puppet. He didn't know, couldn't know, that I held in my hands not just documents proving the land couldn't be sold. I held proof that while he was building his mansion and buying a Rolex watch, his poor father had become the keeper of historical heritage, a man whom a U.S. Congressman remembered and honored 56 years after I pulled him from the fire. I started the engine. The old motor coughed, rattled, but started, as always. Reliable, loyal, like all the old things Marcus so despised. There were 8 days until Thanksgiving. 8 days during which my son would think his plan was going smoothly. 8 days during which he would imagine me signing the documents, the money flowing into his account, and himself getting rid of the burdensome old man.
And I would wait. I would prepare. I would rehearse the words I would say to him at the festive table, when the whole family was gathered, when he would be sitting at the head of the table in his immaculate Ralph Lauren shirt, smug and certain of his victory. And then I would show him the documents, all 4, one by one, slowly. I wanted to see his face. I earned the right to see his face the moment he realized he had lost, that the old fool was not such a fool after all, that the land he was about to sell didn't belong to me and would never again belong to anyone in the Carter family. It belonged to history, to memory, to all those nameless people who rest in the red clay of Georgia. But there was still one question gnawing at my brain, giving me no peace. Would I tell him about the 4th document, about the money, about the fact that his poor father would receive $32,000 a year for the rest of his days? Or would I keep it as the last secret, the final mystery, which he would learn only when— I didn't finish that thought, couldn't, didn't want to. I turned on the wipers, and they began to scrape the glass, pushing the torrents of rain aside. In the rearview mirror, Marcus's mansion was getting smaller, its illuminated windows turning into distant yellow dots in the night darkness. And in my mind, a plan was already forming, detailed, precise, merciless. Because if my son taught me anything tonight, it was that sometimes love doesn't require forgiveness. Sometimes love requires a lesson that will be remembered for the rest of one's life. I am sitting on the porch of the caretaker's house, a small but cozy building, the foundation built for me on the edge of the property. The April sun of Georgia warms my old bones, and I watch a group of schoolchildren from Atlanta listening to the guide by the grave of my great-great-great-grandfather, Ezekiel. 8 months have passed since that memorable Thanksgiving. Marcus never called, not once. Eleanor says I should make the first move, that he is my son, that forgiveness is strength, not weakness. Maybe she is right, but every time I dial his number, I remember the cold calculation in his voice. The old man won't even understand what he's signing. Some wounds heal slowly.
But other voices have appeared in my life. James Connolly comes every month, just to sit, drink coffee, and remember Vietnam. Last week he brought his grandson, a boy about 10 years old, and together we planted an oak sapling at the entrance to the cemetery. In 100 years, I told the boy, this oak will shade your great-grandchildren. That's what thinking about the future means. Eleanor has turned the plot into an educational center. Every Saturday, groups come here, students, historians, families looking for their roots. I tell them about Isaiah, who bought this land with money saved from 30 years of work as a blacksmith. About Ezekiel, who was born into slavery and died a free man. About Lorraine, who understood what I understood too late. A legacy is not what you leave to your children, but what you leave through your children to the world.
Yesterday, a woman from Chicago came. She brought an old photograph from the 1890s. It showed a group of people outside a church. We found that church on old maps of the property. It stood where the old magnolia tree is now growing. It turned out that her great-great-grandmother is buried here, grave number 12. We stood together by that grave, and she cried. And I held her hand and thought, this is what Lorraine set all this up for. Not for money, not for fame. For this woman who finally found her history. For the 17 souls who now have names. For the thousands of people who will come here and understand that their past matters. The phone vibrates in my pocket. Unknown number. I look at the screen for a long time before answering. "Dad?" Marcus's voice. Quiet, broken. The silence stretches between us, like the chasm that opened on Thanksgiving. I saw the report, on CNN, about the cemetery, about you." A pause. "Tiffany filed for divorce, took the kids. The house is being sold for debts." I could have said, "Serves you right." I could have hung up. I could have savored his downfall. But instead, I look at Isaiah's grave, at the oak sapling that James's grandson and I planted, at the children studying the history of their people. And I remember the boy who wanted a red bicycle, who cried at his mother's funeral, who was once my son, before the world taught him to count money instead of blessings. "Where are you now, Marcus?" "In Detroit, renting an apartment, looking for work."
I close my eyes. 74 years have taught me one thing. Anger is a luxury that old men cannot afford. We have too little time to spend it on hatred. "There's a guest house here," I say slowly. "The foundation built it for volunteers. It's empty now." The silence on the other end of the line speaks more than any words. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," I continue, "not right away. But if you're willing to work, real labor, with your hands, there's a place here. The property is large. There's always something to do." "Dad—" "Think about it," I interrupt. "Call in a week. If you decide to come, come. If not, I'll understand." I hang up without waiting for an answer. The sun is setting, painting the Georgia sky in gold and purple. The tour is over. The children have left. I walk slowly to Lorraine's grave. Yes, we moved her here, to Isaiah, to Ezekiel, to our ancestors. "You were right, dear," I whisper, touching the cold marble, as always. The wind rustles the leaves of the old magnolia, and I think I hear her voice. "Some treasures cannot be sold, Joseph. They can only be passed on." I passed it on. In a week, maybe my son will be sitting on this porch, or maybe not. I cannot control his choice. I can only leave the door open. But the land will remain. The names will remain. The history will remain. And when someone stands at Joseph Carter's grave 100 years from now, they will not learn about how much money I earned or lost. They will learn that a man lived here who understood a simple truth. A true legacy is not measured in dollars. It is measured in names carved on headstones, in trees planted for future generations, in stories told and preserved, in doors left open for prodigal sons. I walk up to the porch and turn on the light. The guest house window is dark, but next week, perhaps, a light will come on there, and maybe not. In any case, the Carter land will stand, as it has stood for 100 years, as it will stand for another 100. Some roots go too deep to be pulled out. P.S. If this story made you think, go back to the beginning. Listen to Joseph's conversation with Lorraine on her deathbed. Note the words about the true treasure.
All the answers were there from the very start. We, just like Marcus, look in the wrong place too often.